And I mean, you've seen all this, but I mean, normally I give it about 7-8 minutes so that people get in.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up one more thing, so I'm not.
Yeah, no rush. All good. Are you at your home or are you at the office?
I'm at home.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I feel like that background, when I was in your office at the airport, it seemed like it was a little similar or something.
That would be because the furniture in my office and the furniture here all came from the same place.
Got it.
So how this works, just so you know, is that when Terry worked at SAIC, they were shutting down an executive office.
Okay.
And they were literally going to put everything to the dumpster. And she went to them and said, please, can we just take this stuff home? I mean, you've got nice furniture here. And there was turmoil trying to figure out whether the legal department can allow people to take stuff home. And what they settled on is, on Saturday morning at 7 a.m., we're going to unlock the doors, and we're not going to be there. And whatever happens from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., we don't know about it. So if you want to come in on Saturday and take whatever you want, take whatever you want. We will have already moved everything out that we don't want.
Wow.
That we do want. So whatever's left is going to go to the dumpster. So I got this, you can't see it, I got this gigantic desk. This desk wouldn't fit at the airport.
Nice.
But I got like this credenza behind me. It's all like mahogany. I've got a cabinet over there, a cabinet over there, a bookcase, another cabinet. It's just,
jeez.
And it cost this.
Yeah. That's crazy. So let me, I'm going to go live here.
Okay.
Give me 1 second and we'll, so you've got your screen pulled up. You got the agenda on there right now. So that's fine. There we go. Perfect. I love whenever you get phone calls and all the stuff. It's the same, you know, the perfect times. 1 second.
I see all kind of people coming in.
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah. Hello, hello, hello.
Hey, Stasi. Hey, Gabe.
Hey, guys.
Hey, how are you?
Hey.
Good evening.
Hi there.
Hello. How are you?
Good.
Good. So we've got people still joining here. Hello. Cool. And it looks like we are rolling live over on Facebook right now. So as usual, good evening, everybody. And we'll give ourselves a 6-7 minute buffer here to let everybody get in, get settled, get started. I want to go ahead and mute everybody so that we're all good on the sound for right now. Stasi, you can unmute yourself.
You just like the power.
yeah. Actually, I really don't.
Hey, Dave, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Hey.
Nice to see you guys. Hey, Steve. Long time no see, brother. How are you?
Hey, Gabe. Good, man. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, too. Nice to see you, too.
Hi, how are you? I think that's the first time I'm really attending on a live video.
Yeah, I noticed. That's great. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hope the swag fit okay for you a few weeks ago.
Well, I gave it to Pete. So I kept the hat, and he's my flying buddy. So I gave the t-shirt to him.
I have more, so and they're small, extra small,
Yeah.
so we can work that out.
It was a little too big for me, fortunately.
We can take care of that for you, no problem.
Thank you.
Do we
Sorry
order?
about that.
Do we order those through you, Gabe? If we need to order something, is that how it works?
Yeah, I have right now. I bought a bulk order from a local spot here in Leesburg, and I have about 75 shirts to get rid of. So yeah, let me know after this call.
I'll
if you
take
want.
one.
Okay. I also have probably about 50 hats, so there's quite a bit of
I'll
stuff
take one.
that if you guys have any desire, let me know.
Yeah, I'm interested.
I like how you said, you looked behind you and said, I got it in Leesburg, and you looked behind you. I assume it's about 1,500 feet down.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, they're based in Leesburg. Actually, matter of fact, they ended up moving over to Middleburg. It's called Premier Promotional Products, and they're great. So the owner of that actually owns 412 Charlie Papa, ironically enough. So it's kind of cool. The apparel shop. So,
Cool.
Hey, Dave Masters, nice to see you, brother. Long time no see, man. What
Good
are
to
you
see
in
you.
outer space or what?
No, I've been working nights, dude. So
Oh,
it makes it tough joining up in times like this, but definitely wanted to catch up on a couple of these.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you're a sim guy, so this is right up your alley, right?
Oh, and I see John Somiak and Dave Passmore too. Hey guys.
Hey,
Hey,
Dave.
Stasi.
John?
Hey, Stas.
And to everybody. I'm not trying to just, I only say hello to those two people. That's it. I'm just rude like that.
That's it. I'm out of here now.
You're out. Dave's done.
Well, I know that there's some people that are on right now. Excuse me, that were on Tuesday night with Commander Lippold. I don't know about you guys, but that was quite the story. He was great.
I got
Thanks
to
for
see
joining.
him in Denver last October. And it was pretty close to the same presentation. But he's really good.
Yeah, I actually found you can find the exact presentation. He gave it in 17 or 18 to the FAA, some sort of FAA group. You can find it over there on YouTube.
He's got a formula that works. So I guess why change what works, right?
Yeah, he has a nice studio setup too. He showed us before we went live, and it's pretty impressive for sure.
Yeah, I just had a chance to meet him down in Manassas.
Okay, cool.
Is that Schwartz? Is that who that voice was?
Yep.
That is a voice that you remember.
I see these days that Mike just likes to stay off camera, but you can talk him into getting on camera too at some point. I know.
Enough whiskey, I'll do a lot of things.
Not that kind of meeting.
Or airplanes.
Right. Gotta have a happy hour for that one. Yeah, let's give ourselves 1 or 2 more minutes here, and then we'll get fired up. Stasi, thank you so much, man, for taking the time to put this together and
Sure.
to have a live session with this. What a better time to talk about simulator stuff, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Well, it's kept us all kind of busy these last couple of months. We've been busier than we've ever been, mostly because people, not to jump into this isn't in my presentation, people who really have never touched a computer, much less touched a simulator at home, saw this as an opportune time to start setting stuff up, and they just got in over their heads really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've been on the phone like all day, every day, with all these people trying to help them through doing what they're doing.
But we're grateful that your Leesburg site is open and ready for simulation use.
It
Big
is.
help.
It
Big help.
is. And I've got some more to talk about that coming up here just during the presentation. I
Cool.
think it's okay to say. Hey, Billy, are you on? Oh, no, Billy's doing the IMC clubs tonight. So
Yeah, I didn't see him pop in, but yeah.
Hey, Gabe.
Hey, Adrian, how are you, brother?
Good.
I see you just switched over from Facebook to join us.
I
here in the
did.
room.
I couldn't hear. I had to find a quiet room in the house to be able to talk.
Well, thanks for coming over.
Yeah.
I don't know, real quick before we get started. I mean, I've never clearly watched on the Facebook side. How does that work out for everybody? I mean, for those that have done it, does it? You hear,
That's how I
see,
watched Commander Lippold the other night. And it worked out great. In fact, I watched it on my phone from the car because I was running an errand. It came out great.
Okay, cool. Very cool. I just know that it's hard to interact a little bit unless I see the chat. So that's one reason I asked. So I try to keep it all together. So, but anyways, well, this is great. Thanks for everyone joining again. This will be a fun night with Stasi and Mindstar Aviation. For those that don't know, Stasi is the founder and president of Mindstar Aviation based out of Leesburg, and been doing this for quite some time. Stasi's a good friend of mine, and I just appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight, Stasi. So all you, brother.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Excuse me. So one thing I've noticed is in the time that we've been locked down, I've been doing so much talking. By the end of the day, I'm hoarse. So I apologize if I, every once in a while, reach down here and grab the swig of Gatorade. There has been an ongoing joke because we're working from home so much that I'm at this desk from like 6 a.m. till God only knows what time at night. And every once in a while, I guess to the point where I'll drink the Gatorade bottle and I'll throw it down there at the side and hopefully to pick it up a little later. And then it doesn't get picked up. And then the next hour or two, I have another one and I throw it down there. And then I have a water bottle and I throw it down there. Then Terry walks in and she goes, "My God, you look like the homeless guy. There's all these bottles." And I keep telling her, no, if I was the homeless guy, these bottles would be full of urine. It would not be. So I'm not that guy.
Yeah, that's really Gatorade, isn't it?
It is really Gatorade.
Right.
But anyway, so there's my off color. I'll try to get the off color stuff out of the way here at the beginning, and I'll stop after that. So anyway, thank you all for being here. What I'm going to do, Gabe and I had talked about what kind of presentation to do for this, and a lot of it came out of what I was just talking about. There's so many people trying to set up home simulators right now, and it's old hat for some people, it's new for other people, and it's there's a lot of complexity to it in some cases. So I'm going to spend part of my time talking about that, and I'm going to use a presentation that I did. I've modified it, but I started it for Oshkosh last year, and this was going to be a follow-on presentation I was going to do at Oshkosh this year. Well, now that there's no Oshkosh, you're getting the presentation. So I'm going to do that, but then I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to go techie on you. So there's going to be sort of the presentation side of this, and then there's going to be the technical side. And the technical side will also have two parts. I'm going to get into the simulator itself and some things you can do inside the various sims. And then I'm going to dive even deeper. And Gabe and I have talked about this too, and I've showed him what some of this stuff really looks like behind the scenes and what you're really dealing with when you're dealing with approaches and SIDS and stars and what the GPS sees and what actually is going on. And that's how we named this whole thing Behind the Buttons, because there is just a whole lot of stuff that goes on behind the buttons. You just push and expect something to happen. If at any point during this anybody has a question, please either get Gabe's attention or my attention, or yell or something, and I'll try to stop and answer whatever you need. I'm not going to go through too much of my own personal history because I don't want to burn up too much time with it. Obviously, Gabe introduced me pretty well. I'm the president of Mindstar Aviation, and we make software for flight simulators. We license this software to about 25 different simulator manufacturers, the biggest one being Redbird. So if you fly a Redbird, you're using our software. There's a number of other simulators out there. If you're flying them, you're using our software. But in the United States, the big one is Redbird, and that's our client and very close partner in a lot of this stuff. So for the most part, we're going to talk about some simulator stuff and ways to maintain proficiency at home. I will start with this. I don't have every answer. So inevitably, somebody's going to ask me what I think is the best this or the best that. I won't necessarily know everything. And I certainly can't make all your decisions for you. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to show you today you have to make your own decisions based on your own personal needs and desires and what you expect to get out of your sim or whatever. So this is not going to be a cookbook that tells you what to do. This is going to be more like a overview of the things to consider when you're deciding what you might want to do as far as home simulation. For me, for those you don't know, I grew up in Texas, in Houston actually. I had family in San Angelo, Texas, and in the early 70s, might have even been the latest of 60s, an uncle in San Angelo introduced me to his favorite thing to do, which was to fly radio-controlled airplanes. And that's how I got into aviation in the first place. I learned to fly with things that I crashed at very high speeds into very solid ground objects. But I learned a lot from that stuff. Went to school at Texas A&M in the 80s. That's where I learned to fly in a Cessna 182. Eventually, I moved to Dallas and got a job with Mobil Oil and finished my flight training at Addison Airport in Dallas. Now, in the 90s, I moved to Virginia, also as part of Mobil. That's where I did my IFR rating and my other ratings and started Mindstar Aviation. So I'm trying to go quickly here. Does anybody know who this guy is by his name?
I can read his name tag.
Well, and I probably wrote it nice and big at the top, so you know that too. Well, who Bruce Artwick is, he was an engineer, and he had proposed to a number of different companies in the early 70s that theoretically you should be able to draw aviation instruments on a computer and create something that makes you feel like you're flying, as opposed to what was being done up until then, which was physical simulators. I mean, there were link simulators back in World War II. There were other types of physical simulators where they had machines that were turning knobs and needles and all that kind of stuff. But this man decided we can do this all on the computer screen, and we can do it on a personal computer. And nobody believed it could be done. So he set up a company called Sublogic and created the very first flight simulator. So Sublogic Flight Simulator is what ultimately became Microsoft Flight Simulator, and everything else from that point forward kind of grew out of the techniques that he started. So this was kind of a big deal that he created this. So I want to start, I'm going to unshare this screen, and I'm going to share a video because I want to show you all the steps that went of the lifespan of the simulators created by initially Bruce Artwick. So let me see if this will work. Do this. Technology pause, stand by. And then I'm going to share. All right, hopefully this is not too high res. Let's do this. All right, here we go. What's that?
I didn't warn him I was coming.
Oh, I don't know if that was for me or not. So did that, hopefully that played okay. Did that play okay for everybody?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect for me.
Yes.
So the basic idea there is, if you see where we started, from little lines on the screen that were literally just moving in choppy motion to where we are in 2020, it's like multiple lifetimes of work that have gone into making it turn into that. It's a whole new game with flight simulators now than it was at the beginning. Let me reshare my presentation screen here.
Hey, Stasi, was that last piece at the end, Flight Sim 2020 preview?
It was.
Nice.
It was. So what's going on with 2020 is, whereas all the previous simulators, everything was located on your computer. But when FSX and Prepared are coming out, it is now a 4, 5, or plus gig worth of install. And if you add scenery on top of that, it gets even bigger. With Flight Sim 2020, they've changed it to it's streaming all that scenery over the network connection from Microsoft's servers. So very little lives on your computer except for the base program. And all that scenery is coming down. And as they get more satellite scenery, more of it comes into your simulation. So that's what's going to happen with 2020. Now, it's still in testing right now. There's probably some, who knows what's going to change with this COVID-19 thing, with not as many people working as much on it as would have been had we not been locked down. But I know they are still moving very quickly towards getting that ready for release. But it's impressive. I mean, visually, it's impressive. It's not going to be a viable product yet for a professional simulator, though. It's still going to be a one monitor system because there's so much scenery that needs to come down to display what's going on your monitor there, that it's not designed to be able to handle 2, 3, 8, 10 monitors to have the wraparound scenery like you see in the current sims. But all these things, as they move forward, they're stepping stones. And as you saw in all the simulations that came before, if today we looked at that very first one in the earliest of days in the 70s and 80s, nobody would ever want something like that. But that's all we had at the time. And each step advanced us a little farther. What's coming now is just another advance, and it's just going to keep going. So it's looking better and better. All right, so let's talk about how we use those simulators, or how I've used those simulators to maintain my proficiency and help me with my flying. Before I started Mindstar Aviation, I used to work for Mobil Oil. I started in Dallas. That's the whole reason I came to Virginia. I moved to the facility on Gallows Road. And I spent another decade there as well before I left and started my own company. But at my office at Mobil, I had this beautiful, powerful computer. And every version of Flight Simulator that was ever released was installed on that computer. Each time a new version would come out, I would get rid of the old one, put the new one on there. And there were certain parts of the day where people would notice that I was very intensely looking at my screen. And I mean, we were all software developers at Mobil, and I was really intensely, but every once in a while, you'd see me hitting a lot of keys, left keys and right keys. And, you know, sometimes my body would start going like this and like this. And everybody thought I was just a little bit nuts. I was flying instrument approaches at my desk is what I was doing. And I flew a lot of instrument approaches at my desk. In fact, in my drawer, I had all the approach plates, and on my screen, I had the simulator. And I don't know if all of you knew that there was a thing called the boss key. Does everybody know what the boss key was? Yeah, you could hit this button and it would very quickly throw up a spreadsheet on the screen. So if the boss was showing up, you could get rid of the simulator as fast as you could and put the spreadsheet up and look like you were busy. So I became very proficient at my instrument approaches, as well as proficient at use of the boss key. But what it taught me, and it was interesting because I had not at the time gotten my instrument rating yet, but I inadvertently learned without anybody telling me what I could look at different times based on the maneuver I was doing. And I kind of accidentally figured out, oh, Well, at this phase of the approach, I can look here a little more and scan around and pay attention to this instrument as a primary. And all of a sudden it started making sense organically. So when I finally got my instrument rating, a lot of that stuff really made sense because I had experienced it firsthand. So it really did make a difference for me. By the way, that's the Redbird at Leesburg. So Gabe, I told you I was going to have a couple of polls, but I don't necessarily need to have the answer. I just want you to think about the answers. Think through how many of you have used a home flight simulator. So there's some number of you who have. Then the question is, how many of you have either installed or repaired software on that computer? And I'm assuming that there's some smaller subset of people that have done that, that started with those that have used flight simulators. And then an even smaller subset is probably people who have not only repaired software, but installed memory chips and hard drives and adapter cards and all that kind of stuff. So I'm assuming, and every time I've done this presentation, I have shrinking groups of people. What we found is that pilots are these can-do kind of people. I'm going to get in there and I'm going to do what I need to do. So yes, you can use a screwdriver. But if you can use a screwdriver and you can work on those computers, can you actually build a car? There's probably somebody in the group that's going to say, yes, I could if I had my garage available. But the point I'm trying to make is building a car, building a simulator, whatever you're building, just because you know how to use a screwdriver doesn't necessarily mean you can build that. And I think a lot of people get into the home simulation realm thinking I have, an extra 150 square feet of basement space. I'm going to build this in my basement and I'm going to do it all by myself because it's going to be cheaper than buying that big thing there. So my point to all this, there is a reason the simulators cost what they cost, because the amount of work that goes into putting a simulator together involves not only integrating various pieces of software together, but building new pieces of software that are unique to what you're trying to do, and configuring all this stuff and understanding what happens when a Windows update comes through, or if you're on a Mac, when a Mac updates come through. What all changes have to happen? It is a monumental task. So my point in saying all of this is level set your expectations of what you can do in building a home flight simulator. They are fantastic, but there are people, and you've probably seen them online, they've spent $100,000, $200,000 building a simulator in the garage of a 737 or a 777 or some huge aircraft. They've gone out and bought the seats for the airplane. They've gone out and bought all these wraparound monitors, and they have every overhead panel, every switch, and they've never gotten a pilot's license. So there is a limit to what you want to do as a pilot to improve your proficiency. What the simmers want, what a lot of these people want, is they want to hear airplane noise coming out of the speakers. They want to experience what flight is like. They want it to cost less than real flying. For a lot of them, they want their families to be okay with it because some of them are not comfortable with their spouse or whatever flying yet, and they want to learn something. But that is not necessarily defining what you should use or not use as your simulator at home. So it always comes down to this, and we get the question. In fact, there's people in this presentation right now who have texted me at various points over the last, I don't know how many years, asking me, so what should I use? Should I use this product or that product or whatever? And here's my answer. The main two simulator platforms that are out there, and there are more than just these, but these are the two big ones. There's the Microsoft Heritage line of products, and there's the various versions of X-Plane. On the Microsoft side, we have to also include these products because they all are the same product. Whenever you see those, Microsoft started it, actually SubLogic started it, and then when Bruce Hartwig sold it to Microsoft, it became Microsoft Flight Simulator. And then ESP and FSX and FSX Steam and all the versions of Prepared, those all follow a similar heritage. So usually a product that works in one works in all of them. Whereas products that work in X-plane only work in X-plane. But it's important from this slide to remember that the Microsoft heritage of products includes the Lockheed prepared product there at the bottom. I know there's others, but I'm just going to focus on those two for a minute. So the question is, which one should I use? It comes down to this. Which one should you drink? It's personal choice. Everybody's going to have their opinion on which one's better, which one's worse. I like this one, I don't like that one. Same choice here. We've all, if we've been around long enough, we've had to go to this decision. Do we get the Betamax or do we get the VHS tape player? Then there's this one, Mac versus Windows. Then there's this, Android versus iPhone. So it really comes down to this. We are constantly in the technology world, we have these splits, these sort of mutually exclusive splits where you pick a path and something you do in this path, you can't just hop over to the other path and everything follows you with you. So my question is, if you're using a cell phone and you're walking and texting and you wander into a busy street, does it matter which brand of phone you were using if you walked into the traffic? It really doesn't. It's really about how you use the simulator, how you use that cell phone, how you use that technology to maintain proficiency. That really is what makes your usefulness come out of that piece of equipment. So between the Microsoft line of products and all the ones that come with it and X-plane, there's a lot of similarities. Both have airplanes in them with instruments that you can see. Both have different airplanes, variety of airplanes with different instruments. They both have excellent graphics. They both have something called physics engines, which is what defines what does the air do to the airplane? What does gravity do? What does the weather do to you? Both can accept additional hardware if you want to use more hardware with these things, and both can accept add-on software. So there's a lot of similarities between the two. But if you want to talk about the differences, it really depends on who you ask, because some of the differences matter to some people and some of them don't matter to other people. So it really comes down to who you ask and what their particular thing was. What was their motivation, or what made the simulator great for them? So one of the biggest differences is the physics engine between Microsoft's heritage of products and X-plane. Microsoft uses one physics engine and X-plane uses another. The X-plane people are extremely proud of theirs because they use something called blade element theory as the foundation of all the lift coefficients that are generated by the wings and all the control surfaces and the propellers and everything else. And the problem is, yes, it is a technique, it is a way to accomplish things, and some may feel that gives them what they want out of a simulator. It might give them a feel that's a little different than what they were getting out of the Microsoft line of products. But that doesn't make the Microsoft line of products bad. In fact, both of those products are certified by the FAA in professional simulators. So it does not make a difference at all to the FAA as far as certification is concerned. When you build a simulator around one of those product lines, FAA doesn't care because both are sufficient. When it comes to the availability of add-ons, that is things that you can buy to add to the simulator that don't come out of the box originally. So you might buy Microsoft or Prepared or FSX or one of those products, and you decide you want to put a G1000, a better G1000 into one of the airplanes. Well, that's where companies like mine come in. We sell a G1000 add-on that goes into the Microsoft line of products, and it gives you a better G1000 than comes from Microsoft itself. There are a lot more add-ons available for the Microsoft and Lockheed line of products than for X-plane. That's not to say there aren't a lot for X-plane. There's just more for Microsoft and Lockheed. So if your interest is in having certain add-ons or certain capabilities, your decision point is going to be which product has the availability of add-ons that are what you want. And that is going to define your choice of which one of those you use. Your particular platform, your computer, is going to make a difference. if you have a Mac, you're not going to be using any of the Microsoft or Lockheed products. Yes, I know you can run a Windows image on a Mac. It still reduces performance. You've got to stay in the native Windows world if you're going to be with Microsoft or Lockheed. X-Plane, on the other hand, does have a Mac version. So you have some options. So your particular computer platform requirements are going to have an impact on what you choose. And then there's your own personal preferences. You know, I like the feel of Microsoft and Lockheed, or I like the feel of X-Plane better. It's going to be personal. And that's why I can't answer that question about which one is better, because they both have their pluses. They both have their minuses. You just can't make a choice absolutely. I'm sure there's other considerations. And every once in a while, Gabe, I see some chats popping up. Are there some questions?
Don't see any. Let's see. I do have a question from Ahmed. Does Microsoft Sim have a C182 with a G1000 add-on or DA40 G1000?
So Microsoft does not. I'm sorry. Lockheed does not. Microsoft does. When Microsoft sold the rights to the product to Lockheed, Lockheed didn't want to pay Cessna their extravagant licensing fee to include the Cessna 172 and 182 in the Lockheed prepared product. So if you want a 172 or 182 in the Lockheed Martin prepared product, you have to buy an add-on that is the 182. But the add-ons aren't much. They're like $50. So it's not a big deal. It just doesn't come out of the box like that. Keep me posted if there's other questions too, Gabe.
Will do. Absolutely.
All right, moving on. So like I said, it's not about which one, it's about how you choose to use it. So for the remainder of this, I'm going to talk about how you use that simulator. These guys made something that works. It worked for them, taught them what they needed to do. So it's about how you use the tools to come up with a strategy to learn what you need to learn. You don't need this at home. We might want it at home, but we don't need this at home. I would love to have this at home. But that's about $30 million worth of simulator, and those darn things, they have to run practically 24/7 in order for them to make money. They only shut down for a few hours of each day for maintenance. The rest of the time, there's pilots being pushed through this all day long. And that's because it's so darn expensive that if you don't have somebody in it every operating hour of the day, whether that's 3 in the morning or 5 in the morning or midnight, whatever your sim time is, that's when you show up to do your sim time at Flight Safety. So it's a very expensive proposition, and it takes an entire team to support one of these things. So again, it's about how you use it. The airlines have learned how to incorporate simulators into training. We as private pilots and GA pilots, we have to learn how to use our simulators to maintain proficiency in a slightly different way or with slightly different equipment, but achieving the same goal. You have to treat it like it's real. So what I want to talk about is an example of something that we did. And I'm realizing every time I tell this story, I realize that I'm telling another story about mobile. And it's going to make it sound like the whole time I was there, I only flew Flight Simulator and played Doom when I was supposed to be working. But Doom was I don't know if all you know that, it's a first-person shooter game. And there's monsters, and you have this gun. It was called the BFG 9000, and the B stood for big and G stood for gun, and I'll let you imagine what the F stood for, but that was what BFG was, your big gun in Doom. You could go around and shoot things. But one of the interesting things about Doom is you could design your own, what they call Doom levels. You could design a room. You could design an entire facility if you wanted. So in the evenings, we would stay back at the office, and we were designing a Doom level that imitated and simulated our building. We were all on the 8th floor of our building, and we had Doom levels that were designed to show all the cubicles, all the offices, all the hallways, the bathrooms, everything. We used the square tiles on the floor, which were 1 foot by 1 foot, to measure how far everything was from everything else. So in the middle of the day, sometimes we'd be kind of walking around counting, 35, 36, 37, okay, got it. And, again, everybody thinks we're just walking around nutty. Programmers don't know what they're doing and they're just crazy. But we were measuring how far everything was from itself. And we designed the doom level. But something interesting happened. We were running through the doom levels and we were, playing it after it was all done. And we put monsters in the offices of the people that we didn't like very much. So you could go in there with your gun and just blow up the monster. Which today would probably get us called on some kind of, I don't know, threatening people kind of thing. But the interesting thing was, in the doom level, you could look out a window and decide there was somebody down in the parking lot you wanted to chase, and you could jump out that window and land on your feet at the first floor, having jumped out from the 8th floor, and chase down whatever monster you want to chase down. And an interesting thing started to happen. We would walk to lunch, and we would go over this bridge, and we would look out those windows and go, I could make it. Because you jumped out of that in the game, and you made it in the game, and you picked up and chased what you were doing. And what we realized is we were training our brain on how to do something in simulation, and it translated to real life in a real almost kind of scary way, that we're looking out this 8th floor window saying, yeah, I could make that jump. That would work. And that's when I realized that simulation actually is training your brain. It actually does work. And it gets you to a place where your brain is expecting certain things to happen, certain things to be prepared for. And it's a perfect training tool for flying or for anything else. That's why the Army and the Special Forces and everybody else, they do simulations of engagements on compounds all the time. So we learned what obviously everybody else learned long before us, that it works. But I experienced it firsthand, and it was a very strange feeling to walk over a bridge and say, yeah, I could make that jump. So simulation does work. But of course, a simulator is still a simulator. It's not the real airplane. It's never going to be a real airplane. So you have to learn how to use it and where the lines are and where to kind of just suspend your disbelief to some degree and figure out, I know this is just a simulator, but I'm going to treat it like it's real. And that leads me to probably one of the biggest problems we have with first-time simulator customers is the difference between an airplane or some airplane versus my exact airplane. There are people that want to go so far as, my panel has a scratch right up here just above the GPS. I want that scratch in my simulator. Because yeah, fine, dude, you want that scratch in your simulator. That's going to cost you this. It's going to take this much time. If you want to do that, you're going to have to figure that out yourself. But you can't go asking everybody to build something that's just like their airplane. That's kind of an extreme example, but it translates to, you can have two 172s sitting on the flight line right next to each other, and they both could be a serial number apart off the assembly line, and they're still going to fly differently. They're not going to be exactly the same. You might have a newer engine in this one at some point. You might have a compression problem developing in this other one. They're not going to ever be exact. And the older a plane gets, the more the differences start to come up. So expecting a simulator to be exactly like your airplane is a fool's errand. It's an unachievable goal, because you're going to spend so much time and money trying to make it just like a specific serial number airplane that you don't have any time to fly anymore. Excuse me. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, and a lot of simulator people know this, and instructors definitely know this, that when we're flying a real airplane, our eyes have to be outside. We may glance down at the instruments to get the information we need, but we need to be looking outside. And short of being in IFR conditions where you are fixed on the instruments, you're still doing a scan. But when you're in VFR conditions, your eyes need to be outside. But when you're on the simulator, it is very enticing to sit there and stare at the instruments. And you get out of practice of looking outside. So we tend to try to teach people that when you're doing something on a home simulator, look outside. Train yourself that if you find yourself fixated on instruments in the simulator, get your eyes back outside. There's an outside view out there, look at it. Train your brain to scan and to then go back outside. We also always joke around about what a CFI knows, and it's not enough. The reason we say it's not enough, and sorry for all the CFIs in the room, the reason we say this is that a whole lot of CFIs think in terms of this. I turn on this switch, this light comes on, and that means I can do XYZ maneuver. The problem is when we're building simulations, what we have to figure out is how that really works, because we need to know how a failure might happen. What could go wrong if you turn on that switch and whatever was supposed to happen doesn't happen. The reality is when you turn on a switch in an airplane, normally it just doesn't turn on a light. What happens is the switch energizes a circuit. The circuit then activates some relay somewhere. The relay turns on some or opens some valve. Fuel starts to flow. A sensor over here picks up on the fuel flow. That makes some light or indicator come up on the panel. It's a very long trip from that switch to that light. A lot of times when we're building new simulations, we'll try to go to a CFI, especially on newer airplanes, and we're trying to get an understanding of what the simulator should be doing. What happens when I flip this switch? We're like, well, when you flip that switch, this light comes on, and I know I can do X, Y, Z. It's not how it works. So that's the difference between the simulator and the reality of what's going on in the airplane. So don't be lulled into thinking that when in a simulator you flip something and a light doesn't come on, well, something's wrong with the simulator. It must be something wrong with the simulator. And half the time when we get a call from someone saying the simulator's not working right, I can't get the engine started. That's my favorite one. I can't get the engine started. What's wrong? Something's wrong with your simulator. I want my money back for my time. Sir, did you check the fuel cutoff valve on the floor? Oh. And then they go down there and turn on the fuel cutoff valve, and then they start the engine. It's built to do kind of what an airplane does, but for whatever reason, people kind of throw out the real airplane stuff out of their brain when they're sitting in that simulator. And real world things that could really happen completely trip them up in the simulator. I've watched people try to start the engine with the mixture pulled all the way out, and they're wondering why the engine's not starting. So it is interesting to watch the sort of mental gymnastics that people go through in simulators sometimes. So with all that said, what is the effective use of simulators? And for us, what we've kind of come down to, it's about practicing procedures. It may not be good for practicing exactly how it feels to flare an airplane just at that moment where you can get the wheels to squeak on the ground. But you can get everything before that. When did you drop the gear? When did you drop the flaps? When did you set your power settings? Even if the power settings in the simulator aren't exactly like they are in the real airplane, you still had a checkpoint. I'm at the abeam point, I have to do something to power. I have to do something to flaps. When you're flying instrument approaches, I'm this far from my initial approach fix. What am I doing? What am I going to think about? At what point do I need to start thinking about the next 4 things that are going to happen? Start training that procedure and do it in real time, because it will still translate to the real airplane. It won't feel like a real airplane, and there might be some differences, but remember what you're trying to do is practice your flow, practice the procedure of getting something done and staying way ahead of everything that's going to happen in the airplane. Everybody also knows the importance of repetition in identifying problems during a flight. So you've all seen the people on the ramp who will go out there and they're doing this haphazard pre-flight. They do a little bit over here, a little bit over there. They get distracted, then they're on the phone. Then they try to figure out where they were. They get back to it. That's how you miss stuff. And everybody here has more than likely been taught that start that pre-flight and it's like religion. It's like an entire process that you go through the same way every time. And if you do it the same way every time, it's easier to identify when something isn't right. Because all of a sudden, when it's not the way you expect, you're like, whoa, that's that's not what I expected to see. And you don't just gloss over it. But if you're doing it all haphazardly, you miss stuff. The same thing is true with the effective use of simulators. If you do your procedures in the simulator as best as you can, the way you do in the airplane, then the repetition and the mental gymnastics you're going through to try to remember it all, it will start to solidify in your brain. So do stuff in the simulator the way you do in the airplane, because that's what solidifies the memory. That's what solidifies your procedure in your head. We already talked about instrument scan and not just fixating on instruments. Look all over. Do your scan in the simulator just like you would in the real airplane. Practice emergencies. Kill the engine. Do everything you would never want to do in the airplane as far as emergencies are concerned, because it's the perfect place to try to think through, what would I do right now? You don't need an instructor to pull your engine on you to practice how are you going to do an emergency procedure. Do it yourself, and do it at the worst possible time. Do it on a 2-mile final. Do it on a 4-mile final. Figure out what you're going to do. Do it on a 4-mile final into a mountainous airport and figure out what you're going to do. There was a situation the other day where I think it was the Thunderbird team, not the Blue Angel team, but the entire team started a maneuver where they were rolling to one side, and the lead plane all of a sudden rolled out of the turn. The next plane had to roll out of his turn, and the last one was a little late to realize that something wasn't going right. He peeled out of there. And everybody was commenting on how, oh my God, that was a really aggressive maneuver. They've practiced that. They've practiced that breakaway maneuver over and over again, because that's part of that kind of precision flying. When you're that close to another airplane, you have to have practiced that. So it's not an accident that that person who flew that plane out of harm's way did it with such precision. They've rehearsed that. That was no accident. And that's why nobody was hurt, and that was why no planes touched that day. The last thing is, we always do that. In fact, all of my team at the office, whenever we're about to go on a flight, we'll pre-fly the flight in the simulator. Every year when we go to Oshkosh, we take a slightly different flight path when we're going, depending on who we're going to meet before we get there. We'll pre-fly that stuff in the simulator. And we will have already figured out what the approach looks like. We'll already figured out what kind of, we're going to be passing. We're going to be passing this river. We're going to be passing this town. And you see some of that in the simulator. It may not be perfect, but it's okay. And these days, with the simulator being able to connect to ForeFlight, you can look at not only ForeFlight in your airplane, just like you would in the real, during the real flight. You can flip over to satellite view, and you can see exactly what you would see on the ground from, you know, your ForeFlight. So pre-fly your real flights in your simulators. That's a perfect use of what's going on, what you can do with a home simulator. Don't fixate on exactness. That's not necessary. Don't fixate on instruments. Keep your eyes moving outside as well as inside. Train yourself to look outside. When you find yourself staring at an instrument, break it, break your habit of it. Go back outside and look. You may not have the entire wraparound screens around you, but break your front monitor into sections, just like you break your entire field of view in the real airplane into sections, and scan here and scan here and scan here. Practice it. Don't just play, but practice it. It's not effective not to not treat it like it's real. It's not effective to use your simulator to figure out if you could fly under the Golden Gate Bridge, and I'm going to try it until I get it right. It's not effective. It might be fun, but we try to really make people take it really seriously and do in the simulator as you would do in the airplane. It's not effective if you're not creating habit patterns. And those habit patterns are what will save you when a problem happens, because if you know what you're going to do and you've already thought through what you can do in certain situations, it won't be as much of a surprise and as much of a challenge when the real emergency happens. All right, I see the chats popping up. Let me see if there's any questions.
There's no questions so far, Stasi.
Okay, very good. Very good. So the question then always comes up, if I'm going to do simulation at home, what computer do I need? Well, not that one. That's not going to work. Don't laugh. There are people who are asking this question.
Sorry.
And you don't need this either. You need something in the middle. You need typically a good tower computer. Laptops have gotten better, but laptops are still not capable of holding a big, noisy, and hot video card. Heat is the big problem with all this stuff, because a video card generates an enormous amount of heat, and you need space around it and fans around it to keep it cool. When you drive that video card with ever increasing complex graphics, it's going to get hotter. So you need to cool the computer. That's the biggest problem with simulators, is keeping the computer cool and keeping the video card working the way it's supposed to. Worse yet, in a laptop, you can't easily change out the video card to like any one you might want. There's usually a very limited set of 1 or 2 that will fit in that laptop. So you're very constrained in your equipment when it comes to laptops. That's why simulators are still desktop computer based. You can do it in a laptop and you can do just fine. But if you're trying to really push your limits and push what your machine can do, a laptop's not the place to be. The computers always have to have good video cards. I already said not a laptop. Most of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory based on what I just said. And Gabe, if you want, I can, what's something I did, Gabe, or?
No. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out who iPhone 3 was, because we were having a little chat, and I said, "Who's iPhone 3?" And it was me. I don't know who me is. Move on.
Where did he go?
Sorry, just a moron, just a random idiot here.
And he's hosting.
Sorry, Steve. I should have known that. My bad, Stasi. I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's okay. I saw you laughing, and I thought something was going to be good. So anyway, add-on hardware. Tons of add-on hardware out there that you can add to your computers. Some of this is not very expensive at all. This is a new Thrustmaster came out a couple of years ago with these rudder pedals. Fantastic rudder pedals. They feel like a real airplane. You bolt these things to the floor. You have to have a plywood base on your floor to bolt this stuff down, so that when you push on it, it doesn't just go flying off the other end. But it's really good. Not quite so cheap, but still affordable for not ridiculous amount of money. But with those, besides these two things like this, yokes and throttle quadrants and rudder pedals, besides those, everything else, please don't fall for the marketing slogan plug and play, because there is no such thing. That's a marketing guy or marketing person who wants to try to tell you, oh, it's easy. You just plug it in and it works. Nothing works like that in simulators. Practically everything requires some amount of setup. So don't fall for that. But that having been said, that doesn't mean it's insurmountable. It doesn't mean you can't do it. I'm trying to set your expectations that you can't just expect, I'm going to buy something, plug it in, and yay, I got a G1000. A setup like this, for example. This one's from a company called Noble Flight Simulations, and this one's from a company called Real Sim Gear. In fact, I think some people in this group probably already have bought some of this stuff. And what they are is monitors. They're just extra monitors you put on your computer. It just so happens that they're extra monitors that have these knobs and buttons on them. But these are just extra monitors on your computer. So think about what that means. If I have 3 monitors on my computer, I can drag my email from one monitor to the other, drag this window over here. You could drag your email onto one of these screens right here and open your email on the PFD, because it's just a monitor. There's nothing special about it except for the fact that it's a monitor that happens to have some knobs and buttons on it that look familiar to you. And so to hook this stuff up to a computer, each screen has a couple of cables that come with it. One of them is the video cable, just like your monitor, because you got to get it plugged into your equipment. And the second cable is a USB cable, so all those knobs and buttons can transmit a signal to the computer so the simulator knows you pushed a button. But it's just a monitor. The knobs and buttons are extra. That's just this shell around this thing. So because of that, think about what that means. I'm going to have 3 different places to plug in monitors. I've got to have my main monitor if I only have one. And then I'm going to have a monitor for the PFD and a monitor for the MFD. A laptop doesn't have 3 monitor plugs or monitor sockets to plug all those monitors into. And yes, there's all these various tools. Matrox makes some stuff that can split monitors into 2 and 3 monitors, but that adds complexity. Every little piece is adding more stuff you got to do to set this stuff up. So the stuff looks great and it works really good once you get it set up, but it's not plug and play. So what you basically do is you take your PFD out of your simulator and you make it a separate window and you drag it over to your PFD piece of hardware. And then you do the same thing with the MFD. You drag the window and you drop it over here on the MFD piece of hardware, and then you fly. But that's how they work. These units here are not G1000 coded up inside there. They don't do anything until you've used it like a monitor, just like your extra monitor on your computer. Does that make sense to everybody? Hopefully. All right. Real Sim Gear makes some cool ones too. They make the 430 and 530 as well. So they are really cool to have. But again, level set your expectations about when you get stuff like this. Don't think that you're just going to plug it in and in 2 minutes you're going to be working. Know what you're getting into and ask for help from other technical people. There's people all over that do this stuff, and there's people in this group. I watched them show up today. Some of them I know they've built simulators at home and they've done a good job at it. There's people that can help. We aren't the only people around that can help. So keep that in mind. All right, before I get to the next slide, any questions, and how are we doing on time, Gabe?
Doing good on time. Normally around 8:15, 8:20.
Okay.
Open it up to questions or so.
Any questions before? I'm sorry?
I don't think there was anything there, Stasi.
Okay. Any questions before I move on to some more technical level stuff? Okay. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little more about the actual internals of the simulator and what you're used to using. Now let's see what that chat said. Can these devices be used to log currency? Oh, okay, currency at home. I'm glad somebody asked that because I was going to talk about that and I forgot. The question was, can these devices be used to log time at home? The question was currency, but I'm going to say time in general. The answer is no. You are not going to be able to build a simulator yourself that can ever be certified for logging time. That doesn't mean you don't have the capability to do it. It means the FAA is not going to send an inspector to every person who thinks they've built a good enough simulator to log time on. They don't have the time or the budget for that, and you don't have the time or the budget to pay them to do the certification. If you want to log time at home, your only option is to get a BATD or an AATD. So that means in our customer base, the Redbird TD, or the Redbird LD. I mean, it's the Redbird that doesn't have the motion platform, but it's still got the wraparound screens. That one's an AATD. But when you're talking about those, when you're talking about the Redbird TD, you're still talking about $10,000 to $15,000 worth of simulator. And when you're talking about the LD, you're in the $30,000 worth of simulator in order to get loggable time. But you will not be able to build a simulator at home that anybody will be willing to certify. So that having been said, certified or loggable time shouldn't necessarily be the end goal in all this stuff. Knowledge and proficiency should be the end goal. I know everybody, we as pilots, we like to show something in our logbook for everything we do. But it's just not going to work with a home sim unless you've bought something that's already been certified by the FAA from a company who has a relationship with the FAA. So I know I'm getting long-winded about this, but this question comes up all the time, and it always ends up with, but I could, but, and it's no, there's no but. You're not getting your home-built simulator certified. It's not going to happen. All right, moving on. Somebody said, does X-Plane have a pro version? I wish FAA would approve a standard kit one can install at home. I wish they would too. All of us do. The problem has been that over the years, and I don't just mean recent years, I mean over the last 20 years, there have been a variety of not so great simulator companies that have showed up. And the FAA over that time has gotten more and more strict about what's being built as far as certified simulators. So now, even for us as companies that do this for a living, and we do get sims certified, it's becoming even more stringent for us. So even if X-Plane came out with some pro version, it's still not going to satisfy the FAA's requirements for loggable time. So your issue is not wishing for X-Plane to do this or Lockheed to do that or Microsoft to do that. It's the FAA. That's where your problem is. So if you aspire to take on this governmental entity and try to change their mind, that's where you need to direct your efforts. It's not a product problem, it's a policy problem. Let me see what else popped in.
One, can we log IFR time simulated instrument within the Redbird FMX simulator without a CFI?
Without a CFI. If you already have your rating, you can log that time, yes. The rule is that if you are logging time as part of instruction, you have to have the instructor with you. But if you already have the rating and you're logging time as part of proficiency and maintaining currency, you don't need the instructor with you, as far as FAA is concerned. There may be different policies with different schools and different owners of Redbirds, or any simulator for that matter. But as far as the FAA is concerned, as long as you're not building time towards a rating and you already have the rating for which you're trying to log the time, you're good to go in the simulator. Somebody else asked, what's an acceptable frames per second for flight sim? So this is always a gotcha question on a lot of things. So our attitude has always been about what's enough to get the job done. And quite honestly, the human eye doesn't really perceive that much more beyond between 18 and 24 frames per second. A lot of flight sim people will get all wrapped around the axle talking about, I get 80 frames per second. Well, I get 100 frames per second. In my mind, to a great degree, a lot of the effort and time spent on talking about how many frames per second you can get, it's not necessarily really giving you that much benefit for true proficiency. Yes, it's a proof of how good your machine is. It's a proof of how well your equipment is working, but it's not necessarily going to help you be a better pilot. So when we see anything from 20 and above, we're happy. If we see 80, fantastic. But our acid test is if we start seeing something dropping below 20 frames per second, that's when we're worried and it's time to start doing something about it. Yes, and somebody just said standard MPEG movies, and actually standard video in the United States is 29.97 frames per second. And for that reason, the human eye can't really perceive motion too much faster than that. What it does help with when the frames per second is faster, especially in cameras, is you don't get that strobing effect when you're videotaping something moving, like a propeller. That's why you get those weird effects when you're videotaping a propeller. But you don't need to overburden yourself with trying to go too far beyond those standard video frame rates. Okay, any other questions on that?
The only thing that I would mention here, Stasi, you might be able to finish, or you can do this maybe at the end, but Sukumar had asked, just becoming more familiar with Mindstar and kind of what you guys do. Maybe, that might be something at the end, so
Sure.
you don't mix up your flow here. Absolutely.
No problem, I can do that. Yeah, self-promotion, I'm no problem with self-promotion. All right, so behind the buttons a little bit. So I want to talk about what's really going on in these simulators. So I'm going to unshare this screen in a second and pull up the simulator itself. In fact, I'm going to pull up my messy old desktop and you're going to see everything all at once. But bear with me because it's important to see this stuff.
You're a brave man.
I am, but I did look at it ahead of time to make sure there was nothing embarrassing on my desktop. So for every airplane you look at in a simulator, there's more than four, but there's four main components. There's what we call the model, there's what we call the panel, there's what we call textures, and then of course, self-explanatory is sounds. But every airplane has these four pieces. And those pieces are important to understand where the lines are, where one thing stops and the other thing starts. And so I'm gonna unshare this and I'm gonna bring in the flight simulator screen so we can look at that. So let me share screen one. And tell me if this shows up on the screen.
Looking good to me.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, yes.
All right, so what I've done, I've launched just Microsoft Flight Simulator at 10, FSX. I could have just as easily launched Prepared, but for the most part, everything I'm going to talk about here is identical in Prepared. So when you're looking at the simulator in a flight and you're looking at your instruments, I need to make sure you all can distinguish between a couple of things that you're looking at. So I'm going to switch the view so we're looking at it from the outside. This is what the model is. The model is the physical structure of the airplane. So the wings, the tail, the ailerons, the fact that there's ailerons that move up and down. There's an elevator that moves up and down. That's all part of the physical model. So it's important to distinguish between the model and the gauges. The gauges are the instruments on the control panel. So the control panel consists of any number of instruments and gauges. So for example, this PFD, it's just a gauge. And a gauge, that's a fancy word because it started in the steam gauge days when you had an airspeed gauge and an altimeter and they were all just round. But the name stuck. It's always been gauges. Did I see a cat just go across the screen? No, I did not. I thought I saw somebody with a cat. By the way, I've been lucky that a cat has not marched across here. This is one of the few presentations I've done during this whole lockdown that the cats haven't decided that they want to be part of the meeting. So this is good.
I think it was my blanket, really.
Oh, that may be what I saw.
Yeah, I think that was my blanket.
So anyway, so we're looking at this panel. And this panel consists of gauges. So for example, the PFD, it's a separate instrument. It's a gauge that's part of the panel, but it doesn't necessarily come with flight sim. The MFD is the same way. It's a separate thing. And this whole thing we're looking at is the panel. But when you're talking about Microsoft and Lockheed, there's actually two different ways to view the panel. What I'm showing you right now is called the 2D panel, the two-dimensional panel. I'm going to switch to the three-dimensional panel because once you see that, you'll understand why there's a difference. So I'm going to go to View, View Mode, Cockpit, Virtual Cockpit. That's a long word for the 3D cockpit. When I'm in the 3D cockpit, I can actually look around the airplane. I can look up, I can look down, I can look between the seats. I can zoom in on things down there. I can back out of here. It's actually a 3D sort of model with instruments on it. So you're looking at a blending of technologies all here. You're looking at the model because that's what's making the wings, the propeller, the same model we looked at out here. You're still looking at it here, still the model. But those gauges, the PFD, the audio panel, the MFD, the standby instruments over there on the right, those are all individual extra pieces of software called gauges that are instruments on this control panel. So when I switch back to the 2D cockpit, view, view mode, cockpit, cockpit, pilots typically tend to live here. because they don't necessarily want all the extra stuff of the immersive gaming aspect of simulation. They want to look at their instruments and see them clearly no matter what. And that's why it's flat right in front of you, two-dimensional. I can look at my PFD, I can look over at my MFD, and everything I'm looking at is where I want it to be. Whereas if I'm in the 3D cockpit, you can't see everything as well. In fact, in order to see some of what you're looking at on that instrument, on the PFD, I have to zoom in on it. Well, I'm not looking outside anymore. So remember what I said about practicing your scan and practicing what you're looking at? You can't do that. So if you're back here flying your airplane, you can't necessarily see everything you need to see on those instruments. That's why the 2D cockpit is often better for pilots that are trying to gain proficiency. It is certainly fun to sit in here and be able to look around and imagine I'm in the airplane. Yeah, that's where I spilled my drink last time, and that's where I left the ink spot on the chair last time. It's fun, but it's not necessarily as good for gaining proficiency as the 2D cockpit is. It is interesting to work here because if you look, I can see the throttle move up and down. I can see my propeller levers move up and down. And so it is engaging to be in this 3D cockpit. But as far as training is concerned and maintaining proficiency, we very much suggest that people stay in this 2D cockpit like this because it just works out better for you to be able to see everything all at once. So the other thing, while we're here, and Gabe, this might actually serve that one question that came in of what we do and how it relates to all this stuff. So what Mindstar is, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, Mindstar is a software developer of instruments and gauges for flight simulators. So the G1000 software you're looking at right now, that's what we wrote. It's running inside FSX, and in some cases it runs inside Prepared. But this thing right here, and this thing right here, and this audio panel here, that's the software that we write. So every knob and button that's on the real G1000, we have to figure out how to make this software do exactly what the real one does. This G1000 is just one of many products. I mean, we have the GNS 430 and 530 and Kalin 94 GPSs, and we have a lot of other add-ons that are utility, like we have one that broadcasts your simulator over a network so that your ForeFlight can pick it up and you can be sitting at home using your ForeFlight with your home simulator at the same time. So all these products are what Mindstar develops. The other thing we develop is we purchase the nav data from the real world providers of nav data and package it up and sell it for a subscription to people using our G1000 so they can have current active nav data, just like you have to have your current data in your airplane. So your approaches and your SIDS and your stars will be as matching up in the simulator to what you have on your approach plates in ForeFlight or on paper. And I am going to jump into that nav data thing in a little bit too. I don't want to belabor it too much because then I'm getting really techy, but I think it's kind of interesting, but I'm a goob, so it might just be me. But at any rate, when you're looking at a panel like this, you have to try to distinguish what part comes with Flight Sim and what part is the add-on. It becomes difficult because you can't always tell unless you can separate things out to tell where the real software is. So in order to show you in more detail how that actually works, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up one of our products that's called Sim Supporter, and I'm going to bring up all the airplanes that are in Flight Sim right now. And I'm going to specifically bring up that Baron that we were looking at. So I'm going to put the Baron over here. I'm going to move all these people on that side. Here's the Baron, and we're using this one right here. So if I move the simulator over and I go here, you see how there's a column for models, panels, textures, and sounds. If I go to the panel for this particular one, I pull up this file that all the sim people know as the panel config or panel CFG. And when we look at it in a little more closely, it looks like just a bunch of gobbledygook if you're not a programmer. But what it really is it's showing every gauge that's mounted on this panel here that we're looking at. So here's the PFD, here's the audio panel, here's the MFD, here's the gear up lights, here's the alternator switches, the starter, on and on down. Every instrument that's on that panel back there corresponds to a line right there. And what's really wild is every one of these lines is a program. It's a separate program running inside Flight Sim. So if you look even more carefully, there's a program called MPI G1000. That's our G1000. You'll see there's a program called Beach Baron. And that Beach Baron, you see it over and over, but that Beach Baron program has a bunch of different things in it. It has the gear up light, the left alternator switch, the right alternator switch, and on and on. In the same way that the G1000 has the PFD in it. The G1000 also has the audio panel in it. The numbers are the X, Y, left and top positions of where this thing is going to appear on the screen. So it's literally a coordinate system. X is the left position, Y is the top position. So if I look at it like this, X defines where I'm going to put this across this way. Y defines where I'm going to put it this way. Width and height define whether I'm going to make it narrow or whether I'm going to make it wide. And those are all in pixels. So when you look at these things, it initially looks really complex, but all it really is showing each instrument you're putting on the panel and the X, Y, left, and height and width for each of those gauges. So what that means is you can modify your panels yourself. If you a lot of people get into this, they really want to get into tweaking panels, making it a little different than than it came out of the box. And you can do that in the 2D panel like you're looking at here. Where it becomes more difficult to do your own custom panel changes is if you go into this part of the simulator, the 3D cockpit. Because the 3D cockpit is a blending of the model, this thing, with the gauges. You can't change the model. The model is what it is. There's no way you as an end user can edit or change the model. So you can't change how the propeller works. You can not change the height of the tail. You can't change how big the ailerons are. You can change the color of the airplane, because remember I told you there were multiple aspects to each plane. I told you there were panels, and I also told you, oh, where's my darn window now? Oh, I moved it over here. That's why. Remember I told you there were models, panels, textures, and sound. Textures is the paint job on the airplane. So a lot of people spend an enormous amount of time putting out for free on the internet repaints of airplanes. And they will paint up this particular Baron to be just like their Baron. And they will paint it up with the same colors. If there's a scratch or a mark on their airplane, they'll spend an enormous amount of time making sure that smudge is on this model. And they put it out there for free. It's a little nuts because it doesn't help us as pilots get any better. It's fun. I don't deny that it's fun. And they look beautiful. I mean, these guys spend an enormous amount of time on this. But you have to direct your efforts. If you're trying to use the simulator for proficiency, those things don't necessarily matter as much. If you want to use the simulator to get more of the experience and more of the emotional viewing of beautiful things in the simulator, that's great. I'm not dissing that in any way, but that is not proficiency, and that doesn't help proficiency in any way. Move this back over here. So that's the difference between the 3D cockpit and being able to make changes versus the 2D cockpit and the ability to make changes. But I really wanted to make sure it was clear that all these things you're looking at, these are all little individual programs that somebody wrote. And I will give you a peek. This is what all that stuff looks like. I mean, you know, what we do all day long is write the code that makes every line, every little thing you see on that G1000 screen, we had to write a line of code to make it happen. So, you know, if we had to, in the cases of the GFC 700, we had to write code to make it work like the real airplane. And that's what we do all day long. And the problem is that there's always something new coming out. Garmin constantly updates the G1000. So we have to turn around and figure out, well, what did they add? And we have to make a decision. Does it make cost-effective sense to add the feature that Garmin may have added to the real airplane to the simulation? How much will it cost? How much time will it take? Is there somebody out there that's going to pay for the update to make that work? So that's the cat and mouse game we're always playing. We have to catch up to all the gauges and all the instruments. The G1000 and Garmin equipment changes a little more frequently than an airspeed indicator. You don't typically have, you know, changes to airspeed indicators very dramatically very often, but because the G1000 and the Avidyne and products like that are software, it's easy for changes to be released or new features to be added. Now they've come out with the Garmin G1000 NXI, which for the most part works the same way, but it's got some style differences here and there. So there's people asking us to modify our software to work like that. Without getting too deep into the techie, I definitely wanted to talk about what these panel configuration files mean. And there's products like this Sim Supporter that help you look at what they all are, but you could spend hours, days, weeks tweaking this stuff. And if you like doing that, that's fantastic. But know what you're getting into, because if you want to get that exact instrument to be in the exact spot on your panel, it may not be as simple as, well, you know, I just change a few numbers and it's done. And people embark on something like that and then they get frustrated. So again, keep in mind that there's a reason those simulators you buy fully built up cost what they do, because somebody did all this stuff for you. And there's a lot of stuff. All right, I'm going to move on to something even more techy about the GPS data. Any questions about this stuff that I can answer quickly? I don't know if
there's a question, Stasi, in the chat from Clay. What is your opinion of Simonic, the iPad G1000 simulators? He says, don't care as much about the flight control, etc., just the G1000 operations.
I actually don't know about that one. I've never used that one. I've heard of it, but I've never used it, so I can't really comment on it. Honestly, I think anything that you can use that kind of refreshes your memory and gets your procedures down so you know where your fingers need to go to hit certain functions and features. I mean, anything you can do to maintain proficiency is good.
Sure.
For me, though, personally, that's fixation on an instrument. And what I like out of my simulator is the bigger picture. I want to practice the takeoff. When am I going to turn? When am I going to climb to this altitude? What am I going to see when it's time to clear this next shelf of the Bravo? I don't like to fixate on just the instrument, and that's the only, I would think, for me, the downside for an iPad-based thing like that is that you're fixating on just the instrument instead of the bigger picture, instead of the whole flight. But that in no way diminishes its usefulness in keeping yourself proficient and learning where all the knobs and buttons are, especially when you're first learning the G1000. There's a lot of knobs and buttons. Again, beyond the initial learning of where everything is and incorporating it into a real flight, I personally would prefer having something that I can fly as opposed to something that I just look at just the instrument.
Sure. And then the other quick question, I think this was probably an easy one here. Any plans to do an Avidyne IFD or Aspens? I think
so. The Avidyne, actually, the IFD. So we have the Avidyne Entegra already. And it's basically the style that you see in the Cirrus SR20s and SR22s. We do have plans to do an Aspen. We have actually had plans to do an Aspen for a very long time now. It's just we keep getting so busy. So it's really just a matter of time. And if we have the thing that always elevates a project to become released sooner is a high dollar paying client. I hate to say it, but that's any instrument we create, it's anywhere between 3 and 12 months to create. And that's 1 to 2 people full time on it. It's an enormous expense and it's an enormous undertaking. There's a lot of people that use Aspens, and that's why we will probably take that one on once we get a little bit of bandwidth. But we can't make that decision for just any instrument that appears on the market just because 1 or 2 people decide they want it, because it is a huge undertaking. The process that we go through to create something like that, not only do we have to go and find an airplane that has the real one in it and get checked out in flying that airplane so we can videotape it, and then take all that videotape or recordings back to our office and we pour over it to figure out what did it do? How did things blink when we did certain things? How long did it take between you pushed this button and something actually came up over here? How much of that stuff matters? And we are constantly having to make a decision. Do we want to spend 4 extra weeks getting this, delay between a button push and something popping up on the screen versus move on to the next function? And we're having to balance all this because you could spend forever trying to rebuild the real thing. You end up spending as much as it costs to just go buy the real thing. So simulation is a balancing act always.
I think I know this answer to this question, but it came through Facebook, and I don't want to hold you up, but what about the GTN 650s?
So we're already working on a 650 and a 750. The first versions are going to be available for prepared 4 and 5 because it's a 64-bit implementation first, and then we're going to go backwards and fill in for the 32-bit FSX and prepared. But we already have plans for the 650. We're already working on the 650 and 750. I just can't show it to anybody yet.
Got it. That's it. That's all I got right now, Stasi.
Okay. So I'm going to shift gears into even deeper simulator realms. And that is when you're in here and you're doing your normal thing that you would do, like I'm going to go to Proc and I'm going to select an approach and I'm going to pull up the Leesburg, let's say the RNAV approach to 17, and I'm going to start from Martinsburg. And oh, that's what I was going to say. So as I was doing that, I don't know if you noticed, in our G1000, unlike some of the others, you don't have to find a spot to click to turn the knobs. All I'm using is my mouse wheel. So when I roll this mouse wheel, when I'm hovering over something of importance, like the inner knob or the outer knob, that rolling of the mouse wheel is what's moving that around. I'm not clicking something to make that happen. Same thing is true for the outer wheel or the outer knob on the FMS. If I put my mouse pointer just outside the knob, I am now moving the outer knob or simulating turning the outer knob by simply moving my mouse wheel. I'm not clicking anything at all. So that makes it a lot easier. And another little feature that we decided we wanted to put into this thing is if I go to, let me clear out of this, go direct to, let's say I want to go to KOKV, KOKV, enter. I can type it from the keyboard. When you're at home in a simulator, sometimes dialing in every one of those letters can be a little cumbersome. So we chose that, yes, you can dial it in the real way, just like you do in the airplane. But if you want to just get going, you can type it. And then I can activate my direct to over to Winchester. But in doing that, what I referenced is I selected an approach from a database. And in our case, we have a choice. We can either use the database that comes with the simulator that has data in it from 2005, which, by the way, was long before most of these airports had LPV approaches, or you can add on nav data on top of our software so that you can have the current real world stuff. And that's where our product called Real Nav Data comes in. There's another product out there called Navigraph that some simulator companies use, or home simulator companies use. But Navigraph is not licensed for professional sim use, and it's not licensed for professional training. Whereas ours, we were able to get it licensed so that we can sell it to professionals as well as home. So we have pricing tiers. We have a home price, which was a major concession on the part of all these data providers, because the actual cost of the data is between $500 and $1,000 for the year. And we argued and argued and argued that you just can't do that to home users. And there's already some products out there for home users at that similar price point. So our product for Real Nav Data is available both at a low level cost for home sim users and a higher cost for a certified simulator. But what I want to talk about just a little bit here to round out this presentation is what's really in the nav data, because it is a whole other world in and of itself. So when I pulled up that approach into Leesburg, KJYO, and I pulled up the RNAV 17, and I think I started from Martinsburg. This is the data behind the simulation. How did that drawing show up there? Huh, I don't know what that is. At any rate, this is actually an even prettier view of the data than it really looks. This is what the data really looks like. Every month, this is what we receive from the data providers. 2,100,000 lines of letters and numbers that have to somehow be incorporated into a database that will work when you say proc select approach and type in KOKV. So every month, specifically every 28 days, we receive a data file from Lufthansa if you're using standard RealNav, or from Jeppesen if you're using the Jeppesen edition of RealNav. And the data looks the same because it follows a spec called AirInc 424, and the AirInc 424 spec defines what all this data looks like. But this is what we get. We have to turn it into something that can be queried so that we can pull up specific approaches. So you'll see, here's Martinsburg, here's Caucus, here's Danmo, here's SEAC, there's the runway. And you'll also see there's color differences. There's the yellow, the white, and the pink. The yellow is the transition portion of the approach. The white is the part that's common between a straight in vectors to final versus a transition. And the pink part is the missed approach. Every approach has those three components. You have the transition optionally, you have the common part, and you have the missed approach part. So in many cases, what we're doing is we're having to read, well, in all cases, we have to read this data and figure out what to do, what do we make the airplane do based on this? And what you'll see is not every waypoint necessarily has a latitude and longitude associated with it. In many cases, what these are instructions for the GPS to do something. So we can tell that Caucus has a fixed waypoint latitude and longitude, but this 1,100 feet after you are on the missed approach, it doesn't have a specific lat long. And that's because you're supposed to climb to 1,100 feet before the GPS moves on to the next waypoint. So all the software that we wrote to make the G1000 work, we had to write probably as much again to make all this nav data work. And it's a monumental challenge because any of you who have real airplanes know you get your data cards every month, and there's usually an extra email that comes out that tells you, well, this approach is wrong in the data, so look out for that. This approach is wrong in the data, look out for that. The data has always got errors in it. So all the problems that people have with real airplanes, we have the same problems with the simulators. Inevitably, somebody will have coded the wrong number in here somewhere. And we have to find, amidst all of this, where's the mistake? And decide Do we need to do something about it, or do we just report it back to Jeppesen or back to Lufthansa, and they have to fix it in the next cycle? In the real world, that's all that happens. You report it to the agency that created the data, and hopefully in the next cycle, you get your update. But there's usually a NOTAM that tells you you can't use that approach in that unit. I think I heard a question. Maybe. Maybe not. Okay. Well, at any rate, this is what the nav data looks like. And if you look more carefully across the top here, you can see that the nav data also tells you whether this particular approach is authorized for LPV. It tells you whether this approach is authorized for LNAV VNAV minimums, or if it's authorized just for LNAV minimums. This is not about whether your plane has the equipment in it or not. This is about whether that approach is approved for flying to minimums specified as the LPV minimums. So if we look at the chart, and I've got to bring that up a different way here. Okay. That's going to take me a minute. How am I going to do that? There we go. So if we zoom in on the Leesburg chart here, you'll see you can fly this to LPV minimums of 633. You could fly it to LNAV VNAV minimums, depending on the equipment on your airplane, to a minimum altitude of 725, or you can fly it to the MDA of 940 if you're just flying it as an LNAV approach. So the distinction about which of those you fly is based on you as the pilot determining if your airplane qualifies to fly that level of minimums. So if you have a WAS compatible receiver, you can fly to the LPV minimums. In the data, we know from this indicator right here whether that approach is authorized for LPV. And if it is authorized for LPV and you're flying a G1000 that has WAS capability turned on, we'll show you a glide slope to come all the way down. But there is a direct correlation between all the data on this approach plate and all the data that we have in the actual database. And that's one of the things that's distinctly different between our database and the others, is that we support all the LPV approaches, we support all the LNAV VNAV approaches inside our avionics because we have the data to deal with it. So that brings me to, I'll try to close out here with a question. Which of these approaches do you need a WAS-capable receiver to fly? Which of these levels of minimums, which of these categories? Does anybody know? So it actually caught me, because I thought, well, LPV is WAS, so LPV is what I need in order to fly to LPV minimums. If I don't have a WAS receiver, I'll have to step down to the next one down. Well, the reality is G1000s are certified to fly LNAV VNAV approaches as well if you have a capable WAS receiver. LNAV VNAV uses the WAS signal to give you your glide slope. That is not necessarily true on certain other pieces of equipment. It's a manufacturer to manufacturer difference. But if you are trying to plan a flight and somebody tells you that the LPV approach is not authorized, you can't just step down to LNAV VNAV, because if the reason it's not authorized is WAS in the area that you're trying to fly to is out or out of service, or the augmentation system is not working, or you've lost your WAS receiver, you have to go all the way down here to LNAV and fly it like a straight old plain GPS approach with step down fixes. I did not realize until a couple of years ago that the LNAV VNAV implementation inside Garmin uses the WAS receiver to make that work. So it's interesting, the stuff that we run into in the simulator world, because it directly correlates to what happens in the airplane. There's just a lot to it. And, you know, as pilots, we all look at this right here as the end all to all the information. But as a simulator builder and a software builder, this stuff and this stuff is what has meaning to me. And that's where we have to live on a daily basis. All right, let me stop there. Any other questions? Because I could go on the Goob world forever.
Now, this is great, Stasi. I don't have, Johnny asked, I don't know exactly where this was, but Johnny, if you're, I see you're still on. Do you want to ask your question so that there's more context to that? If you don't mind, or if you're able to. Johnny, can you hear me?
He's got his headset on. Johnny Engel, is that who you're trying to get?
Yep. He was talking about the errors, I guess you mentioned in the database. Yeah,
There he goes. There he's on. What
Yeah,
was your question?
the errors you were talking about in the database that you report back to whoever sent you the database.
Yep.
What kind of errors were those? I'm guessing that's like altitudes or obstructions or things like that.
Not so much obstructions. The problems we usually get is a approach will change at the FAA and it will not have made its way to Jeppesen or Lufthansa. And then they put out their database, which then updates GPS systems around the world, and then the approach is wrong. So that's the most common one, is a fix moves or a fix changes, and it doesn't get reflected in the database, and therefore for that month, all the GPSs that receive that update won't have the right fixes in it.
That's what I meant about it causing a problem for pilots flying those approaches.
Well, that's absolutely why you have to check NOTAMs and the FDC NOTAMs every time you fly an approach, every time you're flying to a new airport, because there could be an FDC NOTAM that's telling you that there's a problem with a particular approach. Now, it may simply say the approach is not authorized. It won't tell you necessarily why. But what they'll do is they'll NOTAM out the entire approach with a problem like that, because what you wouldn't want somebody to do is to fly it and potentially, hit something.
Exactly.
The other problem, just to round that out, the other problem that tends to happen is they will often rename a final approach fix or some kind of intermediate fix along the approach for local reasons. There was a period of time where some of our approaches, some of our fixes had other names for a little while. And they sometimes, for local reasons, they will rename a fix to honor somebody who was a notable person in the area or whatever. And all of a sudden that fix doesn't get into the database. And if it doesn't get into the database, pilots that are looking at it in the GPS won't see it.
Right.
Yes, other questions?
There's a question here in the chat. Does Mindstar build modules for X-Plane also? This is from Supermarket.
Not yet. We are very interested in moving into the X-Plane world, because that's half of the simulator world that we're leaving out. And there's just as many, if not more, X-Plane users out there than there are Lockheed and Microsoft users. It's close to 50-50, but it's slanted a little bit heavier into the X-Plane side.
Stasi, can you mentioned this at the beginning a bit, but can you talk about the, you mentioned for-flight and flying on the network and things like that. Simulator is one world, but also taking it to the next level and flying in the system is another. Can you talk about sort of what that looks like and what you guys are doing with that as well?
So I heard two different things there. So when you're flying your simulator at home, we have a product called GPS VR that's actually it's documented in the for-flight instructions and in the for-flight website to direct people to it. But it's a little product you buy from us. It's $19.95. It's really inexpensive. You can put it into your Microsoft or Lockheed-based simulator, and what it does is it broadcasts the AHRS information and the aircraft position information over your local network, so that if you have your iPad also connected to your local network, your iPad will receive your simulator data as if your simulator was like a Stratus box. And then you get all your position, you can see your airplane on the iPad. So that's the GPS VR product. Now, when you said fly in the system, that then gets into other things like VATSIM, Airspace VR, Pilot Edge, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Those are also add-on products Airspace VR is our ATC system, which is somewhat closed and private for certain schools that use it. Pilot Edge and VATSIM are more open to the public. And it too is a little piece of software you add to your simulator. And there are people working as controllers in certain parts of the country. And you can fly in their airspace and get approach clearances and takeoff clearances and almost like work as if you're in the real system. It's limited in its scope because, as you can imagine, it's manpower heavy. It's primarily, for Pilot Edge, it's primarily in Southern California, although they are opening up more and more sort of other areas for coverage. But for every area that they want to cover, they have to have some number of people that are willing to work that airspace as controllers. And that costs money and that takes time, and it's a monumental thing. So that's why Pilot Edge is kind of focused in Southern California.
Got it. Okay. I used to fly in VATSIM a few years back, and I thought it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
It makes you sweat.
It does, yeah, and they take it serious.
They do.
Dave Passmore asked a question in the chat. Stasi, I don't know if you want to take a look at that. Can you explain how the same coding of the approach will work for both the G1000s with VNAV versus those that don't have VNAV, i.e. when to surprise the pilot with VNAV step downs outside of the final approach fix?
So the data is the same in all cases. Everything about the data is identical. So for example, if I go to the RNAV approach here, you still have all the same information. The difference is if you turn off the WAS receiver or fail WAS in the simulator, it is the pilot's choice or the pilot's decision-making that makes you decide that you need to fly to different minimums. The system itself, as far as the G1000, if you were looking at this, what you would have to pay attention to is in here, if I can get it to get bigger, there we go. You would pay attention to this little indication right here. Because if you failed WAS, this, which would have said LPV if you were on an LPV approach, would automatically change to saying LNAV, which means you cannot fly to the LPV or the LNAV VNAV minimums. But it's up to you to recognize that that happened here in the G1000. And it's up to you to go over here to the approach plate and find out what's the appropriate minimums you're supposed to fly to. And that's how you make your decision. There's nothing in the system of the G1000 that tells you what minimums to fly to. Even though the data has that information in it, the data doesn't make its way through to the avionics. So it's still up to the pilot to make the decision of what minimums you'd fly to. Does that kind of answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, actually it does not.
Okay.
What I was trying to get at is it seems that a lot of times you'll be flying along and you get these step downs with a top of descent and bottom of descent that gets added when you're outside the final approach fix. And it doesn't match what's on the profile view. And you get surprised by that. I mean,
so that is strictly a Garmin creation.
Yes.
That is not in the data. That is not on the chart. That is not an official thing. That is Garmin trying to help you. But in the end, what they do is confuse you, because what happens is
it drives me nuts. One example is on the approach to 1-4 going into KOKV. I ran into it a couple weeks ago flying into Shenandoah, where it starts having me prematurely descend right over the top of Massanutten Mountain.
Right.
As I'm trying to get into Shenandoah. And it's like, whoa, why is it taking me down? I didn't ask for that, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not in the data.
That's right.
That is completely a Garmin creation.
And it's not in the profile view of the approach chart either.
No.
So I don't like the safety of it.
Yeah, it's you really have to know your system, and you really have to know your approach you're trying to fly, instead of just blindly following what the machine is telling you sometimes, because it can lead you astray.
Okay, so the coding is the same. It's just
identical.
How the G1000 interprets it.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Correct. And as a matter of fact, since we're talking about Garmin implementing that, if you run into an LP plus V approach, which they're starting to show up now,
Right.
when you see plus V, that means it's not a real sanctioned glide path. It is a invented thing by Garmin as an assistance thing to help you kind of visualize what your path will be. But when you see the plus sign, as opposed to LNAV/VNAV or LPV, when you see LP plus something or LNAV plus something, you're going to get an advisory glide path as if you happily have a glide path to follow, but that is not legal to fly. That is for advisory purposes only, and you have to fly, you have to honor the step downs. You don't have to step it down. You can follow that glide path, that artificial glide path it's giving you, but you are required to meet your fix altitudes all the way down.
Yep.
Anybody else?
I'm not seeing anything on chat here. I don't see anything on Facebook. So if anybody here on Zoom has a question, want to unmute yourself, feel free. We are about 4 minutes off of 9 o'clock, so we wrap up in the next few minutes, respecting everybody's time. But Stasi, this has been fantastic.
I hope I didn't bore everybody. I hope it was interesting, because this is what I do, so it's always interesting for me.
Well, it's just hard to believe. I mean, all of the software, you and I have talked about this so many times, but all of the things that come out and are updated, and then to keep up and kind of following everything that's happening to then simulate that. I mean, it's a nonstop thing.
Yeah,
I don't know how you stay sane.
Well, it's my job, and it is what I do. But this is where I live on a daily basis in stuff like this, because this is where the work is actually done in all that code.
Absolutely. Well, anybody, before we wrap up here, anybody else have anything that they want to comment, ask, or anything else?
Just have one question, which is, which programming language are you using for this?
C++.
C++.
So the reason we do that from a technical perspective is when you every step above machine language you go, you lose a little bit of performance. And we are, for all practical purposes, writing animation software. So we need to be as close and as fast as we can be, as close to the central CPU as we can be. When you start getting into these higher level languages above C++, like C# or really high up into the Java world and all that, there's just too many layers between the code and the machine. And that impacts performance. And that means your simulation runs slower, your animation doesn't run as fast, and you don't get the visual effects you want. So that's why we live in the C++ world.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Stasi?
Yeah.
Is there anything you can share with us about what Microsoft is doing with 2020 in terms of a software development kit or APIs, so that people like Mindstar could potentially offer G1000 plugins for the new Microsoft Flight Simulator?
So your question was, is there anything I can share? And my answer is no.
Okay.
And I have to just stop on that one. I can't answer any further. You can read between the lines all you want.
You'll notice I didn't ask about Mindstar. I asked about Microsoft.
I know you did.
All right. Okay.
I know you did.
Your answer.
Very good.
I have a question about the Lufthansa databases, I guess. How are those different from the ones like I pay for through Jefferson for my actual real life GPS? Are their databases for simulators only, or are they like using the same data? Could you clarify that?
Gabe, did you catch all of it? Because I couldn't quite hear Zach. I couldn't hear the whole thing.
I believe, Zach, you're talking about the Lufthansa database, and if it's the same database or if it's a different database. I was catching almost every other word, but I think that's what you were saying, right? Zach?
Zach, was that what you meant?
Yes, if you can yes.
Okay, so the way it's a separate database, and the way it works is that we live in a great country here because the FAA makes that data kind of easily available to companies like Jeppesen or whoever else wants to gather the US-based data. But when you get outside the United States and you get into other countries, each of those countries considers their nav data a national resource. So that means Jeppesen has to pay every single country for the data that they're retrieving from them in order to have the right to publish it in their database. Lufthansa has to do the same thing. They have to go pay each of those countries. That's why there's only like 3 level 1 data providers in the world, because it's an enormously expensive process. They have to go out there and pay for that data. And when they pay for that data, they don't just take it and dump it into the database. Each of those companies, whether it's Lufthansa or Jeppesen, they have to code it into this mess right here, because that's what the standards are and that's what everybody expects to see. So they are supposed to reflect the same information, but each company codes it in whatever way they see fit that matches the specs. So there is inevitably differences between the two. It really comes into differences between how certain odd waypoints are named. We don't have too much of this in the US. When you get into Europe, there's a lot of waypoints that are named like CF23. It really stands for course to a fix on a heading of 230. But Jeppesen likes to give names to these things, and they publish those names on their charts and they put that name in the data. Lufthansa is more of a purist and they leave it exactly like the country gave it. So you will have differences between the two, but most of those differences are recognized outside the US, not in the US. Does that come close to answering? Okay, good.
Got a thumbs up. Dave Masters, I saw you were off mute and you went back on. Did you have something did you have a question or?
No, I was just, as Stanzi's wrapping up, I was just, I can definitely appreciate, what he's going through as a business, just because as just a simple consumer, about a year ago, I trashed my regular desk and went from a single monitor to triple monitors, a G1000 system, and some extra gauges and so forth, including flaps and all that. And I thought this is a great hardware setup. I built the plywood frame and the piping and all that around it. And then I went to expand into other aircraft because I built around the G1000 on a 172. When I went to the 182, Stanzi, you'll appreciate this, it didn't support pop-out G1000 windows, which trashes my entire hardware setup because I can't move. It's hidden behind my actual panels, which I'm not going to rip apart my dash just to see the main screen, the 50-inch screen. And so, believe me, when you become, start putting into X-Plane products, I'm waiting patiently. The only reason I'm using X-Plane, I'm not married to it. It's just that the configuration was simple to use to set up 5 different monitors, and I'm actually running it on 2 different machines that are on a private network to power the frame rate for all 5 monitors.
Well, I appreciate that because there's a lot of people just like you. I mean, we get the emails every day asking for an X-Plane version of our G1000. And I wish it was easier to address, but we have to basically rewrite that code so that it'll work in X-Plane.
During your presentation, I actually went to your website and I saw that you had Microsoft X, and I misread it as X-Plane. I was like, whoo, oh, man.
False alert. Awesome. Anybody else have anything? I am looking over here at Facebook. I don't have anything here. Anyone else on the call here in Zoom? Comments, questions, concerns before we tie it up here? Good deal. Well, Stasi, thank you so much, man. This is so awesome. Very good presentation.
Thank you.
Tons of great feedback already. And thank you for allowing pilots like all of us and yourself to learn, even though some of us can't fly during these times.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the chance to talk to everybody, and thanks for having me. And I'm open anytime somebody has questions. You all know how to reach me. I'm on Smokehouse all the time. I comment on stuff all the time. I think I've got a little star next to my name because I comment so much on.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, good stuff. I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you again for joining. I will tell you right before this call, I got word that I think on June 4th, we're going to have John and Martha King as a guest for us here on a Zoom call. So I hope that you can join. You'll see all the invites come out.
Yeah.
But I literally just
That's
got
very
off the call
cool.
about that. Yeah. So
let me throw, Gabe, I want to throw one more thing in because I forgot to mention this, and I hope to God I'm not being premature with saying this. But as we all know, Oshkosh did get canned for this year, but there is going to be a virtual Oshkosh, and Leesburg is going to be a participant in virtual Oshkosh. So the simulator is going to be open, and there's going to be special Oshkosh-based scenarios that we usually do at the Pilot Proficiency Center, and they're going to be available on the Redbird Sim at Leesburg, the Mindstar one. And there's 14 designated sites around the country. They're going to have those scenarios on them. There's probably going to be more than that in terms of home users getting involved, but it's going to be kind of interesting. We're doing our best to try to do something.
That's great.
But
Bring wipes.
What's that?
Bring wipes.
Yes, bring your wipes.
Yeah. Hey, I've got the Smokehouse face masks, so I'll bring those over. Well, that's great. Thanks for sharing that, Stasi. But hey, look, I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in these two sessions this week. A great week with tons of good information. So stay tuned for other events that come up, but stay safe out there and safe flying as always. Thank you so much, Stasi.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thanks, guys. Great job.
Thank you. See ya.